It's 1968 at London's Le Chasse Club, and two musicians meet and begin discussing their mutual concept of a rock sound made up of soaring vocal harmonies and a powerful instrumental backing. The two musicians are John Anderson and bassist Chris Squire, and that chance meeting is the beginning of the Yes story. Hi, this is Ed Sciaky, and for the next 3 hours we'll be profiling one of the most innovative rock bands in history. AT&T is proud to present this showcase of rock, the Yes story, also brought to you by Sears. Sears, your money's worth and a whole lot more. After their fortuitous meeting, John Anderson and Chris Squire went about the business of putting together a band that could embody their new concept of rock and roll. They had drummer Bill Bruford, guitarist Peter Banks, and organist Tony Kaye. Their very special musical idea needed a very special name. John Anderson explains.
In the earliest times, Peter Banks was the original guitar player, and he came up with the name Yes. And we needed a short name. It was either World, Life, or Yes. And Yes was so obscure, I thought, no, that's pretty good. Let's do that one, you know. And everybody we told, we'd say, what's the group called? We'd say, Yes. What? Well, what's the group called, though? We said, no, Yes, that's what it is. And it was just so off the wall. And happily, it works.
Yes got their first big break when they filled in for Sly and the Family Stone at a major London rock club, and even more exposure when they were featured at Cream's farewell concert. The original lineup made 2 albums, the self-titled Yes in 1969 and Time and a Word a year later. Guitarist Peter Banks left the group soon after, and he was replaced by Steve Howe. In 1971, the group gave us the landmark release, the Yes album, which featured the groundbreaking track, I've Seen All Good People.
I've seen all good people turn their heads each day, so satisfied I'm on my way. I've seen all good people turn their heads each day, so satisfied I'm on my way.
Take a straight and stronger course to the corner of your life. Make the White Queen run so fast, she hasn't got time to make you a wife. 'Cause it's time in time with your time and this news is fine, I'm on my way.
From 1971's The Yes album, that's I've Seen All Good People. This is Ed Sciaky. John Anderson tells us how he got into music when we return with more of the Yes story. John Anderson was born in the northwestern farmlands of England, in the small hamlet of Accrington, just north of Liverpool. After visiting Liverpool's Cavern Club, the birthplace of the Beatles, his life's course as one of rock's greatest innovators was set.
Up until I was 15, I hardly left the town that I was born in, and I was working on a farm, local farm. And then I used to see the cars zooming past on the road and think, as I was there, haymaking, which is just cutting the grass and watching it dry in the sun and rolling it over and feeding it to the cows every year, I started thinking there must be something going on out there. And as soon as I travelled, I went to Liverpool and I saw the Cavern, and that made me sort of decide that I really want to, A, be in a group, and B, travel the world. And since then I haven't stopped. I barely will stay in one place more than 6 months at a time. It's just one of those things. I really enjoy moving around.
From the Yes album, that's Yours Is No Disgrace. This is Ed Sciaky. Tony Kaye is up next on the Yes story. Yes was a quintessential rock band of the 70s. Most of the members were classically trained and all were accomplished at their craft. Their songs were more like suites than rock tunes. From the Yes album comes a perfect example. Starship Trooper is made up of 3 separate movements, the first penned by John Anderson, the second by Chris Squire, and the third by Steve Howe. From the Yes album, that's Starship Trooper. As Yes embarked on their first American tour, keyboardist Tony Kaye began to get restless. He explains.
We played support to Jethro Tull on the first tour. And America never really seen anything like ours. We gradually built up a following over here, and you knew that Yes was going to, do something over here. They were definitely going to go a long way. And I knew at the end of that American tour. And then we went back to England and played a big concert, which was my last concert at Crystal Palace. And suddenly there was, the first concert, there was thousands and thousands of people there. So, and I left after that. That was my last concert with them. So I knew that it was going to be big, but it wasn't for me at that time.
Rick Wakeman, a former member of the Strawbs, was enlisted to take Kaye's spot and joined them in the studio to work on their fourth album, Fragile. This is Ed Sciaky. We'll hear some of the classics from that collection when we return with more of the Yes story. John Anderson's acrobatic vocals are probably the single most identifiable element in the Yes sound. His style was one ode to a bad habit and some very hard work, the singer explains.
I couldn't sing falsetto. I think I'd smoked so much cigarettes between the ages of 18 and 20. I lost my falsetto, so I had to build up some form of stance in terms of high notes, and I started to shout a lot and get these high notes, and now I find it very easy to hit the high notes. In some ways I had to sort of sort it out for myself, which is not a bad thing, because people say, oh, that's John Anderson, because they can tell my voice is pretty high, and I'm not a tenor, you see. I'm an alto tenor, which is just above a tenor.
On January 4th of 1972, Yes released their fourth album, Fragile, and it solidified the band's place in progressive rock. They synthesized an orchestral rock fusion with a definite emphasis on rock. Fragile would also help introduce Yes to mainstream audiences with the hit single, Roundabout. From the 1972 album Fragile, that's Roundabout. The song was one lead vocalist John Anderson began writing in the band's earlier days.
That was written in Scotland on one of our first tours of Great Britain. And we were writing the song in the van as we were going towards what seemed, it was a big roundabout on the way to Glasgow. And I started singing, we'll be the roundabout, the words will make you out and out. I can't even remember the words now. But the idea was that the Yes as a group was in a way sort of a cycle thing. It was something that people could evolve around, ourselves included. And the idea was just that we were just a group. We go playing to people, and 24 before my love, I'll be there with you. It was 24 hours before we got back to London, after we played these Scottish gigs, and we're playing Glasgow. And the idea was that we're sort of a roundabout in a way, like a magic roundabout.
This is Ed Sciaky. More from the album Fragile is coming up on the Yes story. The Fragile album did more than help to establish Yes's sound. It also helped establish the band's look. The cover featured the artwork of Roger Dean, an artist whose work has graced many of their covers, including their newest release, Union. John Anderson remembers.
The main feeling about bringing in Roger Dean was to stamp a sort of visual thing to the band, because we didn't think we were very visual to look at. We weren't sort of Mick Jagger or Bowie or very outward-going people. We were very sort of introverted on stage visually. We just play our music. We thought we were just musicians and that was it. And we didn't have to dance around to prove any point. We just had to play our music. So we had to cover that by adding more texture and colour to the staging and the record sleeves. And Roger Dean was perfect to bring out the colour of the music in a way, the texture of the music and art. And that was one of the reasons why we used Roger.
We didn't want to be packaged like another band, being packaged in one way or another. And it didn't seem to turn us on, so we just bumped into this guy, Roger Dean, And I started thinking, hey, Roger, that's album covers, T-shirts, note paper at the office. That would be the group's emblem, visual emblem. We have our musical emblem, but we don't want to be looked as, oh, do we look good this time? Let's take a photograph of the group. Are they looking cool? We're not Duran Duran, you know, we're not that visual band. You know, we're more of a musical band. So we had to visualize it with art. And that's what we did. And it was part of a trend. A lot of people were doing it at the same time. And I've always been interested in the magic and the energy of art. I think it works. I think that people get something out of seeing 3 or 4 album covers very similar. It creates a certain consciousness, a certain perception. So a lot of people would come to me and say, oh, Roger Dean, without Roger Dean it wouldn't be the Yes that we know. Mm-hmm. Well, it could have been Fred Bloggs. I mean, it just happened to be a guy called Roger Dean who brought these kind of paintings along, and it just worked.
From Dean's artwork on the cover to tracks like Long Distance Run Around the Fish, Fragile was a work of art both inside and out. From the best-selling album Fragile, that's Yes and Long Distance Run Around the Fish. Their next album, Close to the Edge, would be the last to feature original drummer Bill Bruford.
I went to what you call college, Leeds University in the UK, and was going to be, you know, a regular guy working for, DuPont. Except that I was always completely smitten by music, and but I kind of kept it out of sight because it just embarrassed everybody. But when I was about 18, I met up with John Anderson and Chris Squire, and we formed this group, and I had to consider seriously whether or not I was going to continue with a college education or follow this musical thing. And drumming is one of these things that you really shouldn't do if you can live without it. You know, it's a hopeless thing, really. And so the only reason I did it was because I couldn't live without it. I think there is something very pagan about a drummer getting up on a stage and playing a drum. It's communal, you know. You come to see me go bang on a drum, and when I do it, you get a buzz and I get a buzz, and it's called music.
This is Ed Sciaky. When we return with the second hour, we'll continue tracing the musical history of one of rock's most innovative bands on the Yes Story over the Unistar Radio Network. Hi, this is Ed Sciaky, and welcome back for the second hour of the Yes Story. With the 1972 release of their album Close to the Edge, Yes was at peak power, a poll-winning, chart-topping, standing-room-only 70s phenomenon. At a length of around 20 minutes, the title cut pushed the band's music to new limits. The second side opened with a John Anderson composition that featured additional themes from Chris Squire and Bill Bruford. It was And You and I, Anderson remembers.
I was going through this incredible self-realization and trying to understand why I wasn't that happy with religion. I tend to find, I was finding out then that all religions met the same ocean. So if they're all the same, why are they always arguing? You know, how can Protestants and Catholics keep arguing and the Jewish and Arab conflict keep going? And it's all based on religion or deep-rooted fear or deep-rooted guilt. And that period of time I was reading Siddhartha and Hermann Hesse, who was writing a lot of sort of esoteric books about self-realization. It's all got to do with how you perceive the world. So it was and you and I, you being the operative outward energy and I being the operative inward energy.
From the 1972 album Close to the Edge, that's And You and I. This is Ed Sciaky. The band undergoes more personnel changes when we return to the Yes Story. After Yes completed work on the album Close to the Edge, drummer Bill Bruford announced he was leaving the band. While Bruford would go on to play with King Crimson and later Genesis, Yes turned to Alan White, a veteran session drummer who had played with acts like the Plastic Ono Band and George Harrison. White continues.
When I was 13, my uncle, who was a drummer, said that I was playing the piano rather percussively, like pounding on the notes quite a bit. So they got me a kit of drums, and within 3 months I was playing on stage after that, even while I was still at school. So it seemed to be some kind of a career building for me. So when I left school, that's all I've done ever since.
Yes Songs, a 3-record live set, was released in 1973, and it took a retrospective look at the Yes sound. That was followed by Tales from Topographic Oceans, a lengthy project spread across 4 sides. John Anderson's choice of an overall theme was an expostulation of the Buddhist 4-part Shastric scriptures. While the release was embraced by Yes followers, the critics were merciless and the general public confused. Tales also brought to a head inner conflicts between Rick Wakeman, a beer-drinking meat-eater, and the rest of the band, sober vegetarians. Wakeman took his leave and was replaced by Swiss-born keyboardist Patrick Moraz. He remembers.
I had to learn 9 albums of Yes's material in a couple of weeks or whatever, during actually, and recording at the same time, relayer. So it was a very big, learning and very intense period of my life there, and then getting ready to go on tour in the States. But I had been in the States before, but I had never played in the States, And although I was playing big concerts with Refugee and selling out, festivals and our own 3,000 seaters, to jump from a 3,000 seater to a 15,000 seater or 20,000 seater arena or whatever is a big jump, And I was like imagining this, and it was very strange.
Moraz didn't stay long. He played on only one album, the critically panned Relayer. Yes then took some time off and released Yesterday as a compilation of their first 2 albums, plus the complete version of Paul Simon's America. From the 1974 album Yesterdays, that's America. This is Ed Sciaky. One off the album Going for the One is coming up on the Yes Story. In 1975, members of Yes began to turn their attention toward solo careers. Within 2 years, solo efforts were forthcoming from John Anderson, Steve Howe, Chris Squire, Patrick Moraz, and Alan White. None of them enjoyed the success of former bandmate Rick Wakeman, as the keyboardist hit with the 6 Wives of Henry VIII, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and Myths and Legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Eventually, though, Wakeman returned to Yes, and the following year he was a part of the album Going for the One. From the 1977 album Going for the One, that's the title track. This is Ed Sciaky. More changes take place when we return to the Yes Story. It was no big secret that one of the reasons Rick Wakeman left Yes the first time was because of his dissatisfaction with the directions taken on the album Tales from Topographic Oceans. He felt the album was overblown and a bit pretentious. The 2 albums the band released after his return, Going for the One and Tormato, were a retreat from the 10 and 20-minute tracks in favor of more traditionally timed cuts. An example was Tormato's Don't Kill the Whale. From their 1978 album Tormato, that's Don't Kill the Whale. By the late 70s, Yes was struggling to survive despite inner conflicts. In early 1980, both Rick Wakeman and John Anderson left Yes because of their musical differences. Wakeman started work on a solo project called Rhapsodies, and Anderson started working with Greek keyboardist Vangelis. Anderson continues.
I started to work with Vangelis, who had been a friend for 5 or 6 years before, and I started to work with him. So it was like working at the opposite end of the scale. With Vangelis, it was spontaneous. It took 3 weeks to make the album, the first one we ever did. And that was, for me, a sort of release.
The three remaining Yes members, Chris Squire, Alan White, and Steve Howe, decided to continue. To replace Anderson and Wakeman, they recruited Jeff Downes and Trevor Horn. The two had previously been a duo calling themselves the Buggles. In 1979, they had enjoyed success with this song.
I heard you on the wireless back in 52, lying awake intently tuning in on you. If I was young, it didn't stop you coming through. They took the credit for your second symphony, rewritten by machine on new technology, and now I understand the problems you could see. I met your children, what did you tell them?
Video killed the radio star. Video killed the radio star.
Pictures came and broke your heart, and now we meet in an abandoned studio.
That's the first song ever played on MTV, the Buggles, Trevor Horn and Jeff Downes, with Video Kill the Radio Star. It seems that Horn and Downes never really fit into the Yes mold. After all, it was hard to fill the spots vacated by John Anderson and Rick Wakeman. John Anderson tells us that even though he'd left Yes, he felt that the band would survive.
I remember at the beginning of the 80s when I broke away from the group, because I was very disinterested in the business side of things. I was becoming very, very disheartened by the fact that you get a record company executive saying to us, why don't we sell 7 million like Foreigner? Yes should sell as many as Journey. You're only selling 1.5 million every album. You should be selling more. I'd say to myself, hey, I don't need this kind of attitude, because I'm not going to dissipate the idea of the band just to make a few more bucks that year, because the next year maybe nobody will like us. So I had to disappear from the scene for a couple of years. And in some ways I think that was a good thing for everybody to realize that over and above the business, the band will survive. The musicians will survive, because the band was originally put together to go on stage and perform to people. It wasn't put together to go make an album or a hit single. It was put on stage to perform and entertain people, and 20 years later we're still doing the same thing.
This is Ed Sciaky. We'll take Yes on up through the 80s when we return to the Yes story. When Yes released the album Drama in 1980, it proved to be the band's least successful album in 8 years. On the world tour to support the album, new members Jeff Downes and Trevor Horn fit into their roles awkwardly at best. The critics blasted the group as usual, but it seems as much as rock critics loathed Yes, the public loved them. While Drama didn't go gold, it reached the American Top 20 on the strength of classic cuts like this one. From the 1980 album Drama, that's Tempus Fugit. By the end of that year, Yes was ready to call it quits. Chris Squire and Alan White went about putting together a band that they were going to call Cinema, while Steve Howe and Jeff Downes teamed with Carl Palmer from Emerson, Lake and Palmer and John Wetton to form the progressive rock supergroup Asia. Here's Steve Howe.
Having worked with Jeff on Drama, the last Yes record, and the Asia records, Jeff and I became sparring partners for some time in all sorts of different situations, and really from that period, I think the song Without You that John and I wrote was one of the first songs that we did for that album. Wildest Dreams off the first one is a very good song by John Wetton. And Heat of the Moment was the kind of banner song of Asia. That was the one that was most known, and in a way that song was a lot of fun because it gave us that kind of pleasure that we wanted, the feeling of being in people's front rooms. You know.
I never meant to be so bad to Heat of the moment, heat of the moment, heat of the moment.
From Asia, that's a 1982 release called Heat of the Moment. This is Ed Sciaky. We'll hear about the rebirth of Yes when we return with more of the Yes story over the Unistar Radio Network. Hi, this is Ed Sciaky, and welcome back to the third hour of the Yes story. After Yes broke up in 1980, its members kept themselves quite busy. John Anderson turned out 2 solo albums and one with Vangelis. Steve Howe was busy with Asia, while Rick Wakeman turned out a plethora of fine albums. Chris Squire and Alan White teamed up with singer-guitarist Trevor Rabin and original keyboardist Tony Kaye to form a band that was tentatively titled Cinema. Rabin picks up the story from there.
When I joined the band, it was just Alan, myself, and Chris, and it wasn't going to be Yes, and so we had no preconceived ideas of what it was going to be at that point. And actually went ahead, and then Tony joined the band, and we were going to call it Cinema. And we went into the studio under that name, thinking in those terms, rather than, you know, the guidelines of what a Yes album would be. But obviously the strong influence of Alan and Chris and was obviously there and would make it sound that way no matter what happened. But so there wasn't going to be Yes, and so we had no preconceived ideas of what it was going to be at that point. And actually went ahead, and then Tony joined the band, and we were going to call it Cinema. And we went into the studio under that name, thinking in those terms, rather than, you know, the guidelines of what a Yes album would be. But obviously the strong influence of Alan and Chris and was obviously there and would make it sound that way no matter what happened. But so there was a lot of freedom in doing what we wanted to do because I hadn't joined Yes. We'd got this band together, and then John joined, so I was very lucky in that I wasn't asked, do you want to come and join Yes? Because then there would have been preconceived ideas of what it should or shouldn't be. Whereas this way I could bring songs which I'd written and ideas and styles which I obviously inherently have, as any musician does, and not have to manipulate them or pull them out of what they naturally are.
While working on what was to be Cinema's first album, Squire, White, Rabin, and Kaye were joined by John Anderson. After his addition, they decided to use the more familiar name, Yes. John Anderson explains.
It was going out to cinema, and the songs were written for 90125.
I can feel no sense of measure, no illusions.
Leave It from the 1983 Yes album 90125. As I mentioned, the 80s version of Yes included as a member a 60s original, Tony Kaye.
Basically, with my conversations with Chris over the phone, was that that he just wanted to see whether it would work. There was really no talk about Yes. It wasn't going to be Yes. The band wasn't going to be called Yes. There was no aspect of let's go back and try and make some money, make money out of it as a kind of, just as a financial venture. It was basically let's just try and play together again.
This is Ed Sciaky. We'll find out what Steve Howe was up to in the mid-'80s when we return with more of the Yes story. Steve Howe left Asia in late 1984 and teamed with Max Bacon, Phil Spalding, Jonathan Mover, and former Genesis guitarist Steve Hackett. With two top rock guitarists like Hackett and Howe at the band's core, they were aptly named GTR. It was 5 years ago, in 1986, that the band achieved success with a song called When the Heart Rules the Mind. Howe remembers.
When we recorded it, we went about it pretty much the same as we went about everything else, which was quite detailed and quite gradual, kind of gradual layering up to the finished record. It was because the tempo's quite up, and yet it's not a rushing. The song isn't a heavy rushing kind of song. Rushing, that is, not Russian, but how did I get that in there? Why did I put that in? So it's got the kind of energy. I think you mentioned that. It's got the kind of energy that we'd like to think that, it's the spearhead for the record.
From Steve Howe and GTR, that's When the Heart Rules the Mind. In 1987, Yes released the album Big Generator. The album was largely a synthesis of the talents of Trevor Rabin and John Anderson, who combined to write one of the collection's most popular tracks, Rhythm of Love. Anderson explains.
It's a collective song. Rhythm of Love was written by Trevor. I wrote some of the lyrics for the verses and the choruses and stuff. It's a very strong song about if you're losing things, if you cannot find a way to reason with yourself about your day-to-day times, you struggle with things and you get yourself into such a mess, you got to try very hard to tune into the rhythm of love, because the rhythm's very, very strong and it surrounds us. And I think that's the idea of the song, more or less.
From the 1987 album Big Generator, that's Yes and Rhythm of Love. Also included on that collection was the Trevor Rabin composition Love Will Find a Way. He tells us that it was a song he really didn't want the band to record, but Alan White insisted otherwise.
There were other songs that I thought would sound better within the band. It just turned out that Alan actually heard it and said, "Oh, I really like that." And I said, "Well, we can try it." And that was a similar story with I Know Lonely Heart. So both those songs sort of came to the band without really being forced on the band.
From the 1987 album Big Generator, that's Love Will Find a Way. We'll hear from John Anderson about one of his solo cuts from 1988 when we return to the Yes Story. In 1989, John Anderson joined with former Yes bandmates Bill Bruford, Rick Wakeman, and Steve Howe. But since the name Yes was still being used by Chris Squire, Trevor Rabin, Alan White, and Tony Kaye, the quartet needed a different name. John Anderson continues.
Somebody said, look, just call yourselves by your names. You are who you are. You're very well known as musicians in your own right. You should call yourselves by your last names. And we just said, okay, Anderson, Wakeman, Bruford, Howe. And they said, no, Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe. I said, why? He said, well, if you call yourself Anderson, Wakeman, Bruford, Howe, you'll get the average white band chasing after you. I said, I don't believe it. Yes, A-W-B-H. I said, no, you know. So it's just sort of, you have to be very, very careful about who you're saying who you are. I mean, the whole thing about the Yes name, it's a difficult situation.
From Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe, that's 1989's Brother of Mine. This is Ed Sciaky. A Yes for the 90s is coming up when we return to the Yes Story. As 1990 came around, there was seemingly great turmoil between the former members of Yes. On one side was Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe, and on the other, the Chris Squire, Trevor Rabin, Alan White, Tony Kaye quartet, still using the name Yes. Well, the rock world received good news when it was announced that all 8 were putting aside their differences in a Yes reunion. That united effort produced the newest Yes album, Union. John Anderson commented.
It was just marvelous to pick up the pieces of friendships and realize that we didn't really have any gripes against each other, and we just really were very intent on working together as a professional unit again, strictly for the music.
From their newest release, Union, here's Yes with the Trevor Rabin, Chris Squire composition, Lift Me Up. Lift Me Up from the newest Yes album, Union. This is Ed Sciaky. More from that album and a look into the future is coming up next when we conclude the Yes Story. The two factions of Yes really united to produce the newest release, Union, on which Trevor Rabin has once again left his mark. Although a relative newcomer to the group and by far the youngest band member, he is established as an integral part of the band.
The whole thing happened quite naturally, and right from the outset it was... There was never any kind of fighting on my behalf to become the catalyst or the, you know, it was easy because the songs we did were songs I'd written.
From the Union album, here's Rabin's Savin' My Heart.
For you, see
From the newest release from Yes, Union, that's Saving My Heart. And Yes fans, coming next month from Atco will be a 4-CD box set called Yes Years that will feature 5 hours of music spanning the band's entire career.